Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here to the First Mile Traceability Barometer webinar. As you might have heard, Farmforce conducted a survey earlier this year to gauge the EUDR's impact towards industry traceability habits, processes, EUDR awareness. As you probably already know, the EUDR is short for the newly adopted EU deforestation regulations. We know it's a challenge to navigate with so much uncertainty in recent weeks regarding the EUDR adoption and implementation, timeline, and so on. So based on the survey, we've gained some really interesting insights, and we're especially keen to note that many findings now show what we've been seeing and hearing at industry events for the last several months. So we're excited to be able to now quantify this. So let's begin. Yeah, so on today's agenda, we have a brief welcome and introduction to those of us you'll see presenting, of course. I will give the survey purpose and methodology and the subsequent findings, whereas Janina will offer a more thorough outline of the EUDR and its context. We'll finally hear from our deforestation compliance expert, Saurav Srivastava, for a more detailed analysis and understanding of compliance. And we're offering to those of you attending today a EUDR compliance checklist to ensure you stay compliant as easily and quickly as possible. So I'm Ellen. I'm a digital marketer at Farmforce, and I'm happy to be working at Farmforce because I see their vision towards a more sustainable and equitable supply chain is really cohesive and positive with my background. I'd like to turn over the floor to our speakers. So if you can go ahead, Janina.
Sure. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Janina Grabs. I'm an assistant professor at ESADA Business School, and I've studied the governance of sustainability in global value chains for the past years, and now also turning to the study of these regulations and their possible impacts, especially in soft commodity sectors such as coffee and palm oil.
Thank you. Saurav, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Ellen. And yeah, it's a great time to be here. We are at the precipice of a great change. So hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. This is Saurav Srivastava. I'm the deforestation expert and the product manager at Farmforce. And I've spent some time developing the deforestation product with our dev team. And I think we have something which is very relevant to the current context in the market. And that's what we'll be talking about more today.
Yeah, thanks so much. I really look forward to hearing from both of you a little bit more later. In the meantime, I'm going to lay the groundwork for what we'll discuss today. And first of all, I'd like to start with the survey purpose and methodology. So throughout Q1 and Q2 of 2023, Farmforce conducted the First Mile Traceability Survey to measure current traceability, any awareness and practices around traceability, explore industry-wide preparedness and challenges, gain industry trends and insights, and of course, optimize our current and future solutions. The following process is what brings us here today, being the chatter in the agricultural industry amongst industry players, which led us to develop the survey. We've taken our time to see the results and build this report. And now with this webinar, we aim to present the results of these efforts and address your specific pain points, any questions, and so on. So we might all be EUDR compliant in due time. Our survey had 29 questions with 87 responses. Our audience remains everyone involved in the agri-commodities supply chain, meaning companies buying from smallholders, cooperatives, traders, processes, etc., worldwide. This audience includes nearly all the crops and regions highly concerned by the EUDR. Moving forward to the Traceability Barometer report, these key findings, I'd like to note that the full report will be made available after the webinar, but we've identified 4 key findings that we'd like to discuss today. Due to the responses of our survey, traceability seems to belong under a sustainability umbrella. Most recently, we attended in cosmetics, an industry event in Barcelona, where many stakeholders and company representatives engaged with us, knowing what traceability is, but were confused about where or even how to start. I've firsthand spoke with companies that had dedicated sustainability initiatives and teams, and these focused on traceability and its processes within these positions. This came out in the survey where we found 60% of respondents are in sustainability related roles, with 40% belonging to IT and operations. If you're attending right now and you're a procurement manager and you work with traceability, we're not saying that traceability must belong to sustainability, but in general practice, we see traceability ownership within sustainability arenas. And if you're not sure where to start, we do think that it would be a good idea to start with your sustainability team. We did notice many responses showed a lack of knowledge towards the main objectives of such sustainability programs, with main findings in the full report that showed a lack of interconnectedness and cross-functionality for these sustainability efforts. And these fell into other categories such as operations or innovations, meaning traceability can often get lost or overlooked. Here is our next finding. Yeah, there it is. Respondents reported that field level or farm level traceability was a top priority. When asked, has traceability down to the farm level been an objective, 90% said yes. So this was not necessarily surprising. However, only 15% of these same respondents can trace more than 80% of what they buy down to the farm level. While everyone has this traceability goal as a broader goal company-wide, they're seeing that few people are currently achieving field level traceability. Here is where we see this industry gap. To dig a little deeper into this, we performed a LinkedIn poll for 1 week to determine the significant pain point in this process. And here we found lack of expertise and a lack of digital tools, or what we call ag tech, as the top two barriers. We take this to mean that there is no full traceability without an on-the-ground first mile presence where data will or must be collected. So I propose to you now, to those of you attending today, are you currently fully traceable? Meaning if EUDR happened tomorrow, would you be compliant? If yes, congratulations, you're doing it, great. And if not, no worries, you're not alone. The report shows this and we're here now. So in our third finding, we found a high risk of import-related deforestation. And while this is also not surprising, being able to quantify what many have suspected, that is a lack of traceability for many ingredients and products on the EU shelves, is important. We see here a need for digitalized processes and digital tools to ease companies, importers, producers, et cetera, to ease their compliance, whether that be EUDR or, as Yanina will briefly describe, other regulations that impact business as we know it. We found that 72% of respondents are either sure that they are importing deforestation-related produce into the EU market, or they cannot verify that these products are deforestation-free. This same 72% will have to soon take action, and we see that as a long way to go. But we, in a more positive light, see that we still have lots of time. However, the work needs to be done. So we'll elaborate a little bit later on that. We do see non-compliance that it will lead to disruptions and consequences. So in this next slide, we have our fourth finding, which fits nicely with what I've just presented. Many supply chains are not ready to comply with the EUDR. On a scale of 1 to 6 of how would you rate the impact of such regulations on your operations, our average answer was 4.7. So EUDR will clearly have an impact, but we do think that with preparedness, the impact does not have to be negative. And with proper timing, implementation, and mitigation, non-compliance risk can be greatly reduced. When asked to elaborate on the most difficult aspects of the regulations to comply with, we found number 1 was field level traceability for all EUDR relevant crops. Number 2 was quality assurance. Number 3, linked imported crops with deforestation events. So again, we see what we've long suspected, but it's important to quantify and verify, knowing where agribusiness players are most worried, thus allows us all to take the appropriate action. So our conclusion here is that the barrier number 1 towards compliance fits very nicely into step number 1 in our EUDR compliance checklist that we'll share later. So this is perfectly normal to us that so much of the EUDR has been only recently solidified, with probably even more adaptations forthcoming, as we'll see in a few moments. But starting on the ground is an important first step towards compliance. As I've laid out, here are the 4 key findings. Traceability belongs to sustainability and its associated roles, and cross-functional teams must be implemented. Farm-level traceability is a top priority for companies, and we've seen that the earlier the data is collected, the earlier the issues that might arise can be mitigated, and compliance down the road will be possible. The high risk of import-related deforestation can be mitigated with early detection and data gathering, and embracing EUDR compliance and everyday business practices now will inevitably lead to more supply chain resiliency and the possibility to continue selling products to, from, and within the EU. More data and insights are going to be available in the full report that you will receive after this webinar. Now that we have highlighted a bit the industry preparedness and awareness, or lack thereof, toward the EUDR, I now turn the time over to Janina for a thorough discussion on the EUDR context.
Thank you so much, Helen. So I wanted to start by taking a step back and helping us understand that while there's been a lot of focus on the EUDR as one of the most stringent regulations in the recent years to affect supply chains, it's by no means the only one. There's been a whole wave of what we call the bucket of due diligence regulations that either has been passed or will soon pass. And so traceability and better knowledge of supply chains is really important for all those. And an easy way to think about the different varieties, the different flavors of regulation, is to think about these 3 types, where the first one, disclosure-only legislation, asks companies to disclose what they already know and what they already do about risks in their supply chains. Then disclosure, due diligence, and remediation legislation takes this one step further by mandating that companies accurately assess their risks, both potential and real risks of adverse social or environmental impacts happening in their supply chains, asks them how are they mitigating such risks, and also potentially makes them responsible for remediating real harms that have occurred in their supply chains. And those 2 first ones tends to be quite whole business focused regulation. So any supply chain that we can think of. And then the third one, that are trade-based legislations, focus sometimes on all, sometimes only on a couple of commodities, and really regulate the import of those into a particular market by saying you will not be allowed to import a good associated with a certain negative social or environmental impact. And so, for instance, the EUDR is one of that latter category, but we also find increasing legislation surrounding modern slavery and forced labor risks that take this approach, for instance, in the US, in Australia, or Canada. We can also think about whether legislations are single issue legislations that really focus on one key topic, such as deforestation, such as forced labor or child labor or human rights, specific human rights. But we also find, and so for instance, disclosure only legislation can focus on that, but we also find some legislations that take a much broader scope and ask companies to think about all relevant environmental and social sustainability criteria, or all relevant human rights that they may find to be at risk in their supply chains. And so while the disclosure only legislation and the disclosure, due diligence, and remediation legislation can fall into both of these categories, the trade-based legislation that we've seen so far tends to focus on single issues. So it tends to be very specific around specific definitions of a risk, for instance, illegal deforestation more broadly, or forced labor. And so we wanted to give also a couple of examples, just broadly, how these different types of legislations might require both traceability and knowledge of deforestation risks. And on the disclosure-based regulation or legislation, we do find some that may include deforestation as an element of the broader environmental due diligence, right? So where deforestation should be brought up as one category of potential risk. And we see, for instance, the UK mandatory task force on climate-related financial disclosures, right, legislation that asks all climate-related risks and opportunities to be outlined. We also have the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or the Swiss ESG Reporting Directive, that asks for similar types of information. So obviously, companies would be at an advantage the more information they have about their supply chains. We also find that the due diligence legislation, especially the ones that have this broader focus on environmental and social risks, may ask companies to pursue due diligence within their supply chains also when focusing on deforestation. The concrete amount or the concrete extent to which deforestation becomes an issue is a little bit different depending on how the legislation is worded. For instance, the German supply chain law, which is already in force, focuses on environmental risks that have human rights implications on the grounds. And so here, it's not explicit about deforestation, but we could imagine deforestation that also violates the rights of indigenous peoples as being of a particular concern. The upcoming EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CS3D, that is currently still being negotiated, to date refers to a broader sense of adverse environmental impact, and also mentions deforestation specifically as one of those potential impacts. And then now focusing on the trade-based legislation and really going into the meat of the EUDR, we also will do this in the next slide, but we also briefly wanted to mention a legislation that is relevant in two other importing destinations in the UK and the US, so we'll do that afterwards. We can basically summarize the goal of this EUDR, the deforestation regulation, to eliminate the import of deforestation-linked commodity products into the European common market. And we really refer to the 7 commodities: cattle, cocoa, coffee, palm oil, rubber, soy, and wood, as well as certain derived products. For instance, leather, chocolate, charcoal, tires, furniture would all be within the scope of this legislation. And important to note here is that all forms of deforestation, so the conversion of forest to an agricultural area, are precluded, forbidden. This includes deforestation that would be legal in the country of production. And who has the highest obligations to make sure that supply chains don't have such products within them? It would be what the EU legislation calls the operator, which is the first actor that places the good on the market, or usually this would be an importer, right? But the organization that clears customs. But then also whoever comes after this organization would also have specific duties to make sure that the product that they're now handling does have the adequate checks and balances and due diligence attached to it. So important to note also is that there's a quite high penalty possibility when companies are found in non-compliance. And while this will need to be implemented by each of the member states' competent authorities, so we don't have the full list of what is going to happen in each circumstance, the legislation provides a suggestion of possible penalties, which include fines, including the fact that the fine for the top offense, the top penalty, should not be lower than 4% of the operator or trader's annual turnover in the particular member state or member states concerned, right? So 4% of an annual turnover, that's a real risk. It's also possible that relevant commodities or products be confiscated, that revenues attached to those commodities are confiscated. Also, a particular company may be excluded from operating within the European market and may be excluded from public procurement processes. And just to highlight again the need to really kick our gears into action. So the text now has been adopted, has been publicized in the European Journal, and will enter into force on June 29th. And then after it enters into force, depending on the size of the company, most companies will have 18 months to move into compliance, and enforcement will start after those 18 months. So by December 29th, 2024, micro and small enterprises will get an additional 6 months. So for them, it'll be basically in 2 years' time. Saurav will give a bit more of a deeper insight on what will be needed to comply for this legislation. So I'll leave it at this high-level overview, but I do want to mention that the EU is not the only one moving forward with such legislative plans. On the one hand, we have the UK Environment Act, which was already passed, and where there's also a due diligence for deforestation-linked imports that is being laid down in the legislation. So here, the UK focuses on illegal deforestation, so deforestation that is not legal in the country of question, focuses on a wider range of commodities. So it includes, for instance, corn, maize, in addition to the ones that the EU also has. Here, we are still waiting on the secondary legislation that will define how this will actually happen in practice. So there's still a little bit of a wait and see approach, but most likely they did already finalize a consultation that ended last year. And so they are in the process of specifying the way by which compliance will be enforced in the next couple of months or years. So. And there's a maximum penalty of up to 250 million pounds, which is also quite high. So, and then the last one that I wanted to bring up before turning the floor back over is the US Forest Act. This is not yet in force. This is still working its way through the legislative process. It also mirrors the UK in that they focus on illegal deforestation according to the country of origin, would otherwise take a very similar approach that a company should have sufficient information about the supply chain. They take, at this point, a little bit of a more narrow focus. So here, coffee would not be included and the other commodities would be. So there's always a tiny bit of a mix, but most of the time, most of the commodities that we're talking about are being covered. And this bill is currently under review by the Senate Committee on Finance. So it had been introduced in the past and wasn't voted on. And legislators, they're trying to form this like bipartisan approach, really want to push it forward, especially since the EU legislation has now passed and is giving them wind in the sails. And maybe just as an asterisk, it is also true that, for instance, the US already requires imports to be free from forced labor. So this would include the requirement to have traceability, ideally down to the production level as well, to make sure that there's not the social risk in addition to the environmental one. And that's it from my side. I'll turn it over to Saurav.
Yeah, thank you so much, Janina. There's definitely a lot going on towards deforestation and like you mentioned, safe practices, human rights, things like that. There's a lot going on worldwide. So that's certainly interesting. I think it's interesting or encouraging that consumers have led this demand in a lot of ways, and now government bodies are following suit. And I do know that you made a thorough list. So just so everyone knows, that legislation list that just briefly was on the screen, that will be available after the webinar. We'll make sure that you can see that because it is quite comprehensive. And thank you for putting the effort into that. So next up, we will switch gears a little bit towards, okay, here's what EUDR is and will be. Compliance, how can we do that? So we'll now have our deforestation compliance expert, Saurav, give us a little walkthrough on easy to digest steps towards EUDR compliance and present our EUDR compliance checklist. Go ahead, Saurabh.
Thanks, Ellen. And again, great to be here. And Janina, I think that was a really interesting summary that you provided for the context of EUDR. And also what's important to note is that it's not just EUDR. It's also the UK Environment Act and the US Forest Proposed Act, which is going to come in. And before I go over the checklist, I think it's, if you remember what we just presented in the results of our Traceability Barometer Survey, there were three primary outcomes of the report. So first was that you got to have a traceability, the first mile traceability needs to be 100%, like you need to have 100% traceability of the first mile. And what you receive in that first mile traceability, you have to have quality assured that data. And the third part was that you need to have that data stored somewhere, which basically means that you need to be able to produce some kind of a due diligence report, irrespective of EUDR, right? So that's the norm. That's what we are hearing from the market. That's what the report says. And now, if we talk about the EUDR context again, and if we have to comply with that, what you would need as an operator or a trader is that you need first to be able to have a GPS-aided digital polygons for each field or crop. So what this means is, and again, I take from the report, one of the findings from the report was that there's a lack of ag tech in the agriculture market. And this basically means that you need to have that first step in place to have the right kind of ag tech with you, so that you should be able to have a GPS-aided polygon map for each and every field. Once you do that, you should be able to quality check those parameters for the polygons. So what does this mean? This means things like you need to be able to do a polygon overlap check. You should be able to do a geography control validation. Let's say if you want to have fields only in a certain geography, you should be able to do that. You need to have some kind of size control validations in place. Different settings in whatever platform you use, so that you are able to control and quality check what kind of data is coming in the polygon data set which you're uploading into the system. And once you've taken care of that piece, the next step, of course, the first step for the EUDR is that you should be able to check for deforestation in that data set. Now, there is very strict definitions for some terms in the EUDR. You have a very strict definition for what a forest means, what does a farm mean, and that's what Janina talked about a bit. So, for example, a farm is defined as anything less than 4 hectares. You don't need to have a polygon, but anything above 4 hectares, you need to have a polygon. Similarly, a forest is defined as 5 hectares. So all of that definitions need to be already in place in whatever deforestation check you're using on the system. And you should be able to check for all of those polygons in a single click, for that matter, when the automated check is running. And in addition to that, you should be able to do a manual check of those field polygons by a field operator. Now, this field operator could be somebody from your own company or organization, or it could be a third-party auditor who's basically helping you comply, right? Now, when all of these steps have been done, you have something of an automated check, you have done a manual check, you have thousands of polygons in your system, which you are ready to start harvesting from, right? You need to have a log of all these checks, so that any auditor, when you're importing that into EU, should be able to trace that right to the bag level, right? And that's what the point number 4, track each bag of produce at farm level means. So you should be able to know where this is coming from a geography standpoint, and also which farmer, for example, was linked to that specific farm, right? And you have all of this data in place. Great, you're there. But the last thing is that you should be able to reproduce this data whenever you're asked for. It could be 3 years down the line, 4 years down the line. It could be an audit by internal or external auditor. And all of these 5 points, if you have in place, then yeah, you're home. Then that's what you need. So I hope whatever system you're using now suffices all of this, or yeah, we're there to help. So this is something which is also important to talk about. So yes, we have a very interesting EUDR checklist. We know what needs to be done. We know what needs to be in place. But there's also some alternative viewpoints, I would say, or criticisms of EUDR. So first off is there's certain lack of clarity in certain terms of EUDR. For example, you don't certainly know how do you define high risk areas, or what do you mean by conversion free areas? So this is something that is being still worked on by the EU, and this will come into place soon. Also, what you have is, as an added or an alternative consequence of this legislation, and some of the critics argue that this will have an additional burden on the farmers. So the farmers have been using the same field for years, decades, and now if this comes into picture, then it may negatively impact their livelihood. The third thing is lack of support for producer countries. Like some critics argue that this produces an unfair burden on the producer countries, particularly in the developing regions. It needs to cater to those countries, that how this will be handled for them. That's an open question yet. And the last thing is there are unintended consequences of the EUDR. Like some critics argue that if you're pushing deforestation to some countries, this may just have an export increase to other countries which do not have such strict legislations. And yeah, so these are some things that are yet to be answered, but I think we are moving in the right direction. Thanks, Ellen. Back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think the criticisms are definitely something I've been hearing a lot about, and they have some valid points. So hopefully these regulations don't have those negative impacts on the ground like many are expecting. So we're just in time for some questions for our audience. With the increased deforestation due to multi-year forest fires in the US and Canada, does Farmforce have plans to expand into those countries? I think that's a really interesting point. I have a feeling, Yanina, you might know a bit more about what is expected deforestation from quote unquote maybe natural causes. Are forest fires a part of that?
So I was just thinking about this and checking this as well. So how they define deforestation is the conversion of forest to agricultural use, whether human induced or not. So the way, again, we'll have to interpret this, but the way that I interpret it is if there was a forest fire that burns down the forest and then people take advantage to grow soy on it, as an example, that would still be counting as deforestation linked product, because if the deforestation doesn't need to be human induced, it could come from natural causes. I guess the intent is that these areas would be reforested instead.
Sure, that makes sense. I believe this next question could be maybe more for Sorev. Does the Farmforce solution cover the points mentioned in the compliance checklist? Can you generate a compliance report for each lot exported?
Yeah, for sure. And that's a great question. And our platform basically has been based keeping EUDR in our mind. And yes, so it starts from the farm level. We have the capability to link the farms to polygons, farms to farmers, and eventually the harvest to the farms, which also will be able to be made into any kind of custom report, including something like a bag level traceability report, which tells you whether this farm from which it has been sourced is deforestation compliant. And it will give you a complete log of what kind of checks and when have they been carried out.
I have another question, and it looks like it might be twofold for Yanina here. Do you think bamboo will be covered under wood at some point under the EUDR?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know that there will be a review process that happens that I think they have a couple of steps intermediate, both in terms of expanding the product scope. I think if this is after around 3 years, and they also want to review the regulation as a whole, including its impacts on smallholders after 5 years. So I would only be able to speculate, but my instinct is that it's likely that depending on how well it works in the first instances, that more products will be covered eventually. I'm not sure whether that will be applying to bamboo specifically.
Do we know more on when low or high risk countries will be defined by the EU? So I see this kind of as a question more for Janina, but maybe both.
My understanding is that so the limit of when those categories need to be clear is the same 18 months that will also, after which enforcement will start. So at the very latest, at the same point, by the end of 2024, there should be this list. Until the list is published, all countries will be assumed to be standard risk, so neither low nor high. And while the legislation is written in a way that it would make it possible to have this list like prepared ahead of time, I have heard legislators say that it only makes sense when they're both like the list and the enforcement starts at the same time, because otherwise they're worried about some negative consequences of that. So I wouldn't wait for it too early, let's put it that way.
Yeah, that I agree. I guess this might also be a question for you, Janina, and maybe Saurav. Is there a threshold below which deforestation is okay? I take that to mean a land area.
Yeah.
I would let Janina answer that first, and then I'll add on to that.
Yeah, I mean, here again, what we need to look at is what is defined as a forest, right? And so the way that they define as a forest is an area of at least half a hectare, 0.5 hectares, with a tree canopy of 10%, and trees higher than 5 meters, or trees able to reach these thresholds if they just kept growing. So in theory, they don't say that there's a level of deforestation that is okay, but what I have heard people say in practice is that areas that are smaller than 0.5 hectares, right, don't fall into the category of what would be considered a forest. So like cutting down a single tree that's like in a field of nothing would not necessarily be considered deforestation.
Okay, yeah, good example.
And just adding to that, and that's exactly what I was looking for from Janina. And so what basically it means for the general operators and traders who work in this industry is that you should be able to have a platform which allows you to alter what it means to consider deforestation. Like you should be able to set it up in terms of hectares and maybe in terms of percentages as the definition of deforestation evolves amongst the ODR and, say, for example, the US Forest Law. So right now, there is a lot of interpretations to be made, but what would be the safest for you is to have a platform which allows you to have that flexibility.
Sure.
Again, we do that.
Yeah. I wanted to say or ask, how are the EU planning to mitigate the possible diversion of commodities to Asia or Latin America because of these rules? I think that's a good point. Again, maybe Janina, to you first.
Sure. So the legislation does also consider that the EU should make efforts to convince, like diplomatic efforts, basically, to convince other countries, especially major importing countries, to adopt similar types of rules, so as that leakage market would be closed smaller and smaller over time. So I think that's the main way that they would want to do this. One could also argue that most likely, if they don't want to, end up with no product, being that they're the first ones, there may be some form of price premium, but that will be sort of market-based, right? Like there may be an incentive to make sure that it's still worthwhile for companies to continue importing, but that's not regulated. That would just be my assumption based on market forces that there might be. And also, right, it always depends on the supply and demand balance of how much clean product versus dirty product a particular company is sourcing, whether it also makes sense to basically create a bifurcated supply chain and be able to trace that. For many companies, it may actually just make more sense to move holistically into compliance, also to set themselves up better for the future and be a front runner in these efforts.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. Saurav, we do have a question. What percentage of tree cover loss is considered in the Farmforce solution? But I imagine that is not just Farmforce coming up with numbers. Okay.
Yeah. So, and you're right. So we are not the one to define what is a tree cover loss, what percentage. But the answer to that is similar to the previous question which I answered. And what you need in a system is that you should be able to adjust the percentage, the canopy percentage, to whatever legislation you're working with. If it's EUDR, it's yet to be defined. But let's say, for example, Rainforest Alliance talks about 10% canopy. So you should be able to adjust the percentage canopy on the platform so that the deforestation results adjust accordingly.
Sure, that makes sense. This also might be a question for you, Saurav. How many years back, or I guess both, we've talked about it earlier, how many years back should the farm be checked for deforestation?
Yeah,
maybe an easier answer.
That's again similar because it depends on the kind of legislation. So EUDR talks about it from December 2020 onwards, which means 2021. If you're working with Rainforest Alliance, it's 2014. So yeah, it depends on what legislation you're working with. And yeah, so your platform should be able to adjust that as well.
Okay. Yanina, do you have anything to add to that, or is that?
No, just to say, yeah, exactly. So cutoff date for the EU would be the 31st of December, 2020. And so I think what is important to note, right, is that there tends to be a time lag between the deforestation event and the time that a crop is actually being produced on this. And so here it really focuses on the land in question. So if you have a plot that was deforested after like December 31st, 2020, and you can see that in the satellite imagery that it went from forest to cleared land, it may take a couple of years until crops are grown and like moving into the market, but that would still then be considered deforestation linked goods. So here it's really good to have sort of that look into the past with satellite imagery as well.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that. And kind of piggybacking off of this topic, someone asked, how do you ensure quality assurance of data collected from farmers beyond GPS data, including data on child labor and other social risks? This did get a lot of upvotes, so I wanted to mention it, of course, but we're not trying to do too in-depth of Farmforce's offerings, solutions, services. So I will just say that we work with entities like Global Forest Watch, there's GPS, there's polygon mapping, we have surveys you can run, and a lot of that can be found on our website. So I don't know if we need to take more time on that here, but I just wanted to say that really quickly. Okay, and I did have this question for you, Nina. Are agroforestry systems considered to be forests?
No, they're considered to be agricultural use. So this means two things then. On the one hand, working your existing agroforestry system. So for instance, managing shade trees would not be considered deforestation, but moving a natural forest changing this into an agroforestry system by now planting plants underneath these existing old growth forests, for instance, that would be considered deforestation because now you're converting the forest into agricultural use, which is the definition of deforestation.
Okay, sure. Yeah, thank you. That makes sense. I kind of saw maybe where you could go with that, but you made it a lot more clearer. So thank you. Are the results produced by this software verified by any organization and accepted? Do we have any documentation supporting it? I take that to mean if you use a software provider, are they verified by anyone else and that kind of a thing? To piggyback off of Saurav's presentation, basically any software provider that you're using for first mile data collection or any full traceability, anything like that, needs to be a company that can be verified by other organizations, meaning, as Saurav mentioned, Fair Trade, Rainforest Alliance. There's more coming up and everything. And so the easy answer to this is just yes. But supporting documentation, that depends on the certification body. They can request what they would like. We at Farmforce are GDPR compliant, and we're underway with ISO certification, things like that. And that's something I think industry standard that you can expect from a software provider that's on the ground, no matter the country. Okay, Yanina, what is your opinion about accepting historic deforestation? Idealistically, we would convert all the farms that have already been deforested back to forest. Is that at all realistic with regulations like this worldwide?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I guess the challenge with all of these either voluntary or now regulatory efforts is that they need to define a cutoff date. And that, of course, then creates winners and losers. So the winners would be the ones that converted just before the cutoff date, and the losers, especially those who converted between the cutoff date and the coming into force of the regulation, because you didn't know that was going to happen, but also everybody after that. And that's just a reality. So we do see that. For instance, I also work in palm oil, and you have a number of large plantations that are now considered deforestation free, but this is because they have deforested all of their land before deforestation became an issue. I think with these types of regulations that are mainly intended to protect existing forests, that's kind of unavoidable. But where I do see an interesting effort at restoration, especially, would be when we now talk about net zero commitments and insetting of carbon within value chains. So we're already seeing efforts, especially in areas that are agroforestry possible, such as cocoa or coffee, that companies are making efforts to assist farmers to grow more trees on their farms, moving it more into biodiverse areas. And also, right, like other companies are looking into funding restoration efforts as one way of moving towards their net zero commitments. And this, I will say, these types of efforts are also increasingly moving from soft to hard legislation. We see that the CS3D, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, will ask companies how are they moving their business operations in line with the 1.5 degree Paris Agreement target. So here it might be where we're counterbalancing this. But yes, in this case, I mean, for these types of regulations, it's a little bit, it does not cover historic deforestation is the short answer.
Okay, sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. From your survey, have respondents mentioned other regulations that could be impactful for the industry? The answer is basically yes. It's included in the report, and we made sure that in the webinar, we discussed most of those that were mentioned from respondents. And that kind of just naturally occurred with Yanina's background and focus in doing this. A lot of people were aware of some of the things that she just naturally was presenting to us today. Are there specific people or institutions that make your work harder? If so, how can we hinder their efforts? Strategies for organizing, collaborating, direct action, things like that, that limit the power of bad actors in a way. I'm not really sure the answer here. I think it's more, as far as EUDR is concerned, this is as Yanina mentioned, this is more of a balancing act between consumer-led initiatives, consumer demand, what do they want, and then legislation, so like soft and hard legislation. I think that, and I'm going to turn this over to Yanina, I think, when I'm done, but I think the one thing that we can do in as far as organizing and collaborating is just having that awareness of brands or supply chains, and knowing where they're going, and having consumers basically purchase with a conscience in a way. But yeah, Yanina, if you have a better answer than mine, that'd be nice.
Yeah, maybe I'll modify the question a little bit. I mean, because my work as a researcher, I mainly observe, but I do have a focus on trying to understand how these kinds of systems can be made equitable as well as effective, especially these types of new regulations. And I do see that right now where we are is a little bit of a two-track system where individual large actors, like especially the private sector, is starting to move. Of course, there's still uncertainty, but it's moving very fast to try to build systems that are bringing them into compliance. And the ones who, like producers who maybe are not linked to these more powerful companies, there's much lower level of awareness of what is necessary for those types of producers. And so any form that of collaboration, especially within sectors and within industries, that can help also level that playing field a little bit, maybe thinking about how to share best practices, share approaches, and empower farmers also in a way that gives them ownership of their data and benefits from sharing that data, I would very much support. And I think there's a little bit of more room for action there, because as I have seen it, of course, the knee-jerk reaction is to look internally and try to figure this out for one's own company, but there's the possibility that the most marginalized will just be left behind. And I think here collaboration would be really nice.
I totally agree. So one last question. This one is for you, Janina. Maybe you can shed some light on the mass balance approach versus EUDR compliance.
Yeah, that's also a good question. So in short, the EUDR does require that you have every single GPS point that is associated with a particular shipment, but it doesn't regulate how large that shipment needs to be or how small. So in a sense, what one can do, as I understand it, is to aggregate information further and further, right? So if you have a container of coffee, for instance, you would have a lot of GPS points, especially if you're like moving and you're putting together different types of bags. And so whatever, right, like it's regulated initially on the level of the shipment coming into the market, and then thereafter when it goes into like production, it'll be sort of like whatever the shipment is that the consumer good has. So in that sense, there is a possibility of aggregating, but of course that aggregation also bears more risk, because there's, again, no real, not as far as I understand, no real leeway or like margin of error. So as soon as you have one farm that is non-compliant, that disqualifies the particular shipment in question. So you can imagine that like the more information you aggregate, the more possibility is that that will create higher potential risks for that shipment in question. And in terms of mass ballots, that is not really considered. So the fact of the way that certification schemes have originally worked, that as long as there's something coming in and something coming out, it's seen as equivalence. No, it does have to be linked to the specific good in question, but can be aggregated.
Okay, thank you so much for that answer. And first of all, thank you so much, everyone, for attending today. You can expect to receive the full report, webinar recording, slides, EUDR compliance checklist, all of that from us in due time. In the meantime, as the digital marketer for Farmforce, I would really appreciate it if you would head over to our Twitter and LinkedIn pages and follow us, keep up to date with everything. We'd really love to hear from you. Please stay engaged with us by email, social media, whatever you need. And yeah, I guess I thank you so much to our speakers. I've learned a lot today, and I'm so grateful for your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Great.